Okay, so thank you very much, Jose Maria. And I also would like to thank Isaac for telling me to attend this workshop. But well, he's crazy and told me, okay, you can talk about. We're talking about the clear language, intercultural education, information, overload of information, obscurity of language. And I said, okay, yes, I got it, no problem. But then I have been listening to to you, and I thought, what am I doing here? Because this is such a technical and fantastic development. And I just have some ideas on education and some examples, down to earth examples of the everyday school contexts or educational contexts in which I move around, right? So, well, anyway, feel free to hate me and tell me, okay, Nieves, thank you very much, but never come back again. So,
No, no, I think it's what we needed. We needed something like that.
okay, okay. Well, my contribution, as a suggestion from Jose Maria, of course, is entitled the "To Be or Not to Be of Information and the Need for Clear Language in Intercultural Education." Right. So, the starting point. So let me see if I can move it. Okay. Um, okay. So, the starting point is that nowadays we're facing a very different reality in the educational context, right? Very different from some years ago, because what our classrooms do nowadays is to reflect, to mirror what there is outside, which is a increasingly globalized environment. So we've got participants in the educative process, participants belonging either teachers or students, but especially students belonging to many different cultural backgrounds, different realities, etc., etc. So this implies that it's absolutely necessary to apply an intercultural perspective and multicultural perspective to our teaching. So this idea of these educational realities isolated from the situation in the rest of the world, well, it's something of the past, or maybe applied just to upper class realms, right, which are very limited. But 80%, 90% of the population does not belong to these spheres, right? So instead of trying to assimilate all these different backgrounds and realities, the idea is that it is possible to live together culturally under the basis of dialogue, respect, etc., etc. So what is the consequence as far as education is concerned is that we need to generate different models of education, more diverse, more plural, right? So in this context, the basic role of language is paramount, right? Language is essential because it's the means by which a culture expresses itself, negotiates meanings, describe material reality, also applies to present other issues such as social codes, such as expressions of identity, for example. So that is why the intercultural communicative competence is so important, right? And it's been recognized at this macro legislative level, for example, by the European Union with the Common European Framework of Reference for Language, and also, for example, in the Spanish context by the Instituto Cervantes, which is the one who regulates this spread of Spanish language, right? So we've got the idea of intercultural education, which is basic nowadays, then the importance of the role of language in this context of intercultural education. And so we go down one more time to clarity of language, which is fundamental. And why is it so important? Because communication is the key. So if we use ambiguous, obscure language, this provokes communicative failures. And if we use this language to spread biased traits, this reproduces conceptions that are not favorable to this idea of interculturality that we need to work on, right? So when we use this obscurity of language, what we are doing is putting the emphasis on the code, right? So we are displacing the importance of the addressee and even the message, right? So it also, this insistence on the code, what it's doing sometimes is acting as a mechanism to regulate the access to certain educational realities, but not only for members of other cultures, but also for the more disadvantaged members of our own culture, right? So it that's what I have called a system of gatekeeping. Okay, you understand, you pass. No, you don't pass, right? So um, we may we must be able to allow democratic access to knowledge, but this does not imply extreme simplification, right? But that we try to avoid obscurity, because if we develop informative clarity in the sense of linguistic clarity, clarity of ideas, clarity of expression. So we put the emphasis on the message and on the addressee, but not on the code, which is important as well, right? So don't misunderstand me. I am a philologist, and I am very keen on using the right word in the right place, etc., etc. But we will see some examples later, and which are really illustrative of what is happening, and you will see that this is not exactly what we are meaning here, right? So what is the reality in our classrooms nowadays? It's very different from this model of intercultural education with stress put on clear language, etc., etc. So we've got certain sectors with certain students with specific training needs or educational needs. I'm not talking about special needs as far as disabilities or nothing of the like is concerned, but because they are just wanting to train on specific areas of knowledge, right? So in the field in which I work, which is teaching English as a second language and Spanish as a first language, it's very easy to find this reality, which the higher level of language control implies, not from the everyday life, but from an official assessment point of view, a greater complication of the code and a greater obscurity of the message, right? So it's like as if it's created a kind of arcane meta language, right? Only accessible to a selected few. So here at this point is where the first contradiction, the first to be or not to be, the first dilemma arises. So how to combine a clear way of expressing oneself with a high level of formal linguistic development, with an adequate control of the language and favoring the correct transmission of information and not being obscure, right? So at this point, I think it's interesting to refer to some illustrative examples, right? For example, there is a growing tendency in this context of teaching English as a second language to confuse second language proficiency with mastery of this second language in its most complicated form, right? And this premise is even beginning to be applied in the context of high-level professional training, which require a very high level of language proficiency. For example, in the entrance exam for the course that will later qualify candidates to become air traffic controllers in Spain, students have different tests of English, of course, which are very important, especially the speaking test, right? And one of the exercises worked this year, because every year they change the model of the exam, is that the student is read or has to read a short prelude to a topic, and then he or she is asked several questions. And the required level of the students is C1 plus, around, yeah, C1 plus C2 at most. So I would like to read you one of these preludes which has been used this year and has, well, come to me in a very obscure way as well, that I'm not going to describe, right? But I think it's fantastic. So the prelude says, museums, long perceived as dispassionate conservators of humanity's cultural legacy, now face rigorous deconstruction as ideological apparatuses that actively mediate historical consciousness through deliberate curatorial strategies, acquisitive practices, and representational hierarchies. Far from being neutral, by institutionalizing epistemic hegemony, under the guise of preservation, museums not only reify dominant historiography, but also provoke fundamental questions about the very nature of historical truth and cultural authority. And then the questions start. Right. So, this is an incredibly elaborated way of introducing questions in an exam. Is it effective? Absolutely not, because all the linguistic effort of the candidate is placed on trying to understand, not in answering the question or trying to summarize mentally the prelude and say, okay, now I understand and I can answer all. In fact, I was just rehearsing this test with a student with this prelude, and she understood something completely different and was answering the questions wrong because she couldn't understand, and she's got a C2 level. So completely an absurdity, this obscurity of language. And this is also happening, for example, for the official exams for the military as well, the high level, which are going, which are organized by NATO, the exams, right? Well, a second example in relation with the leitmotif of our workshop today, information overload. So this information overload can occur when we try, for example, to develop some of these active methodologies that are currently promoted so fixedly in Spain, at least in our classroom. For example, project-based learning. If we do not apply this methodology correctly, what some teachers or many teachers do is just tell the students, okay, you need to gather information on whatever, up to you. Okay, so what the students find is tons of information, most of it obtained from Wikipedia, which is could be okay to start, right? But they are not taught to identify relevant content. They are not taught about the credibility of sources, the difficulties to summarize the information, etc., etc. So if they are taught to manage information clearly and to present it accurately, this they are going to be successful in their projects, right? Does it really happen in our classrooms? Not in many cases, right? And a third example in relation as well with the seeds and exclusions of the title of the workshop concerns misleading and biased information, because students in certain educational settings may receive this deceitful information due to cultural misunderstandings, language barriers, different social norms. But in the case at hand, right, this mistaken information may be conveyed by the kind of materials we use in the class. And, for example, by one simple element, which is the photographs that are included in the textbooks, right? That sometimes do not avoid misrepresentations of social groups, nationalities, subjects, etc. So to illustrate this example, I've made just a brief study of just one single business English textbook. I'm not going to give the title or no the publisher. Well, the publisher is one of the most powerful in the world, so the list of suspects is reduced. So I just paid attention to the photos of humans, because you know in a business textbook there are all those computers and graphs and money, etc., etc. So I'm studying very briefly just one book and having a look at the photographs, we've got 48% are single men, many of them showing their faces in the foreground as if it were this passport or personal identification photograph. 16% are of groups led by men, showing them in a position of leadership, being listened to, leading meetings, etc., etc. So there is a total of 64% of photos of men showing them in managerial and proactive roles. 28% are photos of women, only a couple of these foreground faces. And 13 are groups of women. The female figure is dominant, but these groups show a female teacher, a female doctor, so these are the traditional female roles, two female tea growers, cultivators, and only one female engineer. On two occasions, there are groups of women, but not in meetings or nothing similar. So around a computer as if they were looking for information. One photo is of a woman completely desperate, and another one is a group of young girls having a coffee and chatting as if it were Sex and the City, and well, with a hint on multiculturality because one of them is wearing a Muslim style scarf or multiculturality, right? So I think the message is very clear. The information is clear in this visual text. Okay, if you want to have a leading position in the business world, you must be a man because this is a man's world, right? So this is directly related to issues of exclusion that are and deceit as well. Okay, so here comes the big dilemma, the big to be or not to be. Should we leave things as they are and let others, like policymakers, legislators, do what we or what some of us as educators should start to do to solve the situation? Or, well, as Hamlet would say, do we take arms against this sea of troubles and by opposing end them, right? So if we want our students to move in this receptive educational world, intercultural world, rich in all aspects, we have to modify many things. And I have been dealing with three of them here. What kind of output do we want from them, even if we are dealing with things with a high level study of language, of second language or the first language? We have to question the apparently innovative traits of these new methodologies that we sometimes are imposed in schools, right? And third, we have to reject these biased representations of stereotypes in the materials we're using in our classrooms, right? So if we want to change this unbalanced situation, so we have to detect it, and this is what we are doing here. So this has been my contribution. I guess it's not as technical as yours, but is based on our everyday life at the schools, right? So thank you very much.